races. But if you also kind of look underneath the surface of Georgia politics, the Georgia Republican Party has been ripping each other apart. And Riggs Amico is going to talk to us about this. There's been some expected shadiness since the election, but Jeff Duncan, who ended up getting the lieutenant governor race there, he only got his seat or his candidacy by essentially sending out some very dubious messages about sexual misconduct on the part of his primary opponent, that even as suspicious as I or any of us here may be of certain Republicans, his claims against his primary opponent were extremely dubious and probably false.
And very well funded.
And very well funded.
$8.2 million in dark money.
Yep, exactly. So millions of dollars in dark money went into a Republican primary to shame an opponent to get Jeff Duncan the nomination. So this is a party that's wounded. And if you also look more locally, if you have the stomach for keeping up with, say, the Cobb County Republican Party, they've been ripping each other apart because they can't stand the fact that Cobb has flipped. And you look at the numbers and the votes that Sarah got and that their Democrats got here in Cobb County. I mean, it surpassed and blew the numbers for Hillary out of the water. And that was the first time that Cobb flipped blue. So things are very encouraging around our local community. And yeah.
You hear about what they did at the delegation meeting?
Yeah.
No, what was this?
I was at the Cobb County Democrats this morning with most of our delegation. They are going back in. We are going to have a Democratic chair and vice chair, just like the Republicans had when they were the majority of the delegation.
Yeah.
Turns out the Democrats know the rules just as well or better.
Yeah, the GOP's played pretty dirty around here, but also hasn't just played dirty with fighting the Democrats. It's played dirty in destroying themselves. Whereas you can see across the board, we may have lost some statewide races, but despite the massive numbers that were moved in all these elections, there's unity among our side. And that's something to be said, and it's going to really help us moving forward. So without any further ado, I'm thrilled and always happy to introduce Sarah to speak to us.
So we're going to sign up here. I know, what is it? It's almost 2 o'clock, so everybody's probably getting the post-lunch sugar lull, so it is the perfect time for us to talk now. We're going to have this amazing habit of giving this talk at the moment when everybody is about to go to sleep. But this will wake you up, and it should. And in all seriousness, this is intended to wake you up, metaphorically. What happened this year, first and foremost, while we're setting this up, I want you to understand, I know you're disappointed. I know a lot of us were, that we didn't get all the outcomes we wanted. But I want you to be very clear. This was not a loss. And when I say that, as you know, I'm a math person. You're going to know it a lot better here in about a half an hour. But we had, I think, 800,000 people who cast a ballot for the first time in Georgia this year. That is a massive win, not just for Democrats, not just for ground game democracy. And for those of us where that was the starting place of all of this, that matters more than anything. We had literally tens of thousands of volunteers who knocked on 1 million doors in the state of Georgia. Even for the lieutenant governor's race, we had, hundreds of volunteers who wrote more than 500,000 postcards, these beautifully handmade postcards from Postcards to Voters that went out for Stacy and I. We also had, I think, very good discussions in corners of the state where people didn't realize there were so many Democrats. And I would put up here in this part of CD11 right there in that mix. And that's so important to changing the conversation, because even when you don't win the election, you've inserted a form of accountability into the process. And I will say this, we had an event out at Reynolds Plantation. I mean, I'm giggling because that's where President Bush raised all his money in Georgia, right? It's like the den of the lions for Republican money in Georgia. We went out there. We had 3 hosts who said there's no county party in Greene County, so we can't call the county party to get you folks to come to your fundraiser. but they called the voter rolls for 3 counties, the 3 contiguous counties. And when we walked in, there were 70 Democrats all walking around saying, I have no idea. And they, as I understand it, they've launched the county party out of the event we hosted there. So, however, yeah, I thought that. So, however disappointed you were, please don't think of this as a loss. We flipped 2 Senate seats. We flipped a dozen seats in the State House. This was very much a win, and we have rewritten the way the electorate looks in Georgia. And if you think about it, how many times in the last 20 years do you remember every single presidential candidate coming to Georgia, right? Or Nikema Williams was saying, our new state party chair this morning, that she, in the last 48 hours, has gotten 3 calls from Democratic presidential primary candidates. Yeah, because they know, right? They know that what we've told you for the last year is true. Georgia is not a red state. Okay, so get this with me. Georgia's not a red state. That's right. We're a blue state with a turnout and voter suppression problem.
Yes.
And so we also, it turns out, may have one more problem. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is 3 things. Number 1, I wanted to say thank you. You have no idea what it meant to those of us who disrupted our families' lives, who missed bedtimes with our kids, who had to figure out how to do our day jobs and our candidate jobs all at the same time, to have people who we knew were spending their weekends knocking on doors for us and writing postcards and sending emails and hustle parties. We are grateful. And I think my family and me personally, our lives are changed for the better because we were able to have this amazing opportunity to run for office. And even knowing the outcome, I would do it again in a heartbeat. And I will. So I'm going to move this over so I can show you. So first and foremost, thank you. Secondly, there is a little issue we need to discuss about the lieutenant governor's race. And some of you may have seen Jim Galloway's amazing article in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Jim is a total pro, resident of Cobb County, by the way. And what I love about it is there's no partisanship. He is just giving you the facts. He's asking important questions. He accurately summarized my point of view on this issue, which is that there were more than 100,000 votes missing in the lieutenant governor's race. Now, can you guys see this, or do I need to move it out of the light or over
I
a
can
little?
turn on these backlights.
Can we do that? Okay. Okay. So about 8:30 p.m. on election night, thank you. About 8:30 p.m. on election night, I went to my blue-haired husband and said, we're running behind the statewide ticket. And it was noticeable. It wasn't huge, and we were still only a 0.5 percentage point behind Stacy. So I thought, well, you know, we'll give it a beat and see if this is just a fluke because of which counties have been counted. But within an hour, we knew that the gap wasn't budging. And by 2:30 in the morning, we had received the first call that there was a voting machine in Fulton County that had been taken offline because voters claimed my name did not appear on the ballot. We are now sorting through about 8,000 or 9,000 such complaints of all different kinds of configurations. Some of them say the lieutenant governor's race wasn't on the ballot. Some of them say specifically my name wasn't. One of the strangest ones is actually the first time I did this presentation was a couple months ago in Paulding County, and a young man sitting in the front said, hey, your name was on a different screen. I said, what do you mean? And he said, well, on my voting machine, all the gubernatorial candidates and your opponent were on one screen, but we had to scroll to the next screen to find your name. So he's since done an affidavit. There have been a number of anecdotal stories about problems in the lieutenant governor's race. But if you're an analytic like my husband or me, anecdotes are not sufficient evidence. So we actually dug into the math. And by 10 a.m. the next morning, we had essentially found this. So let's see, is that leg? Can everybody see?
I can close the sheets.
Yeah, maybe Andrea, do you mind getting thank you, the 2 on the left.
Yeah.
Okay, so what you're looking at here is drop off. Does everybody understand drop off? There's a lot of different ways to look at this statistically. So fancy statisticians would talk about residual votes. Let's set that aside. It's a different way to say the same thing. This is simpler. Drop off means 100% of the vote was cast for governor, right? And then as you move down the ballot, you typically shed a few votes along the way. That tends to be about a 1, maximum 2% drop off, right? And what that does, these are the statewide offices. This is the drop off rate. The gray line is the 2010 midterms here in Georgia. The red line is the 2014 midterms. And the blue line is the 2018 midterms. And what you can see is that drop-off typically has this nice, gently sloped curve, right? And in fact, in 2010, the offices weren't in the same order on the ballot, but the curve is still the same, which tells us that it is not the name of the office that drives the percentage of votes you lose, but literally your physical position on the ballot. This vampire fang right here is drop-off between governor and lieutenant governor in 2018. That is not normal. Oh, I'm so glad you asked because I'm about to tell you. So, so in the lieutenant governor's race, that is a 3.5% drop-off. But let me tell you what's more interesting. My opponent, his drop-off was a little over 1%. It was totally normal. Mine was 5. Yeah. And so we thought, well, this is interesting. How big is that? And it turns out that represents between 118 and 138,000 votes conservatively.
Who's conservative?
Yeah, conservatively. Because there were 169,000 votes lost between Stacey's race and mine for governor and then lieutenant governor. And then what you would have to believe this is normal is that 130,000 of those people then woke up and voted the rest of the ballot. It's not normal. So we called a friend at the Harvard Business School, a professor. In fact, she used to run the Harvard MBA program. She's no slouch. She's quite intelligent. And I said, look, what do you think of this? Like, we think we're missing more than 100,000 votes, maybe as many as 140,000. And she said, well, it just depends. Where did they come from? Oh, by the way, if you want to see all the statewide candidates drop off, every color is a different race. And you can tell the lieutenant governor's race here doesn't match anything else, right? So that's a different representation. So when this friend told me, professor told me, you need to go and look at where they came from, we did just that. So this is the 2014 midterms. Each bubble is a county. The bigger the bubble, the bigger the county. This is that 2% range we talked about for normal drop-off. And this is the drop-off from governor to lieutenant governor in the 2014 midterms in Georgia. Do you see how they're all tightly packed in that 2% range? And the curve, the shape of it, is essentially flat, right? Which is normal, because typically you would see the same drop-off between each of the races, right? So does anybody want to see what it looked like in my race? Yeah. That's not normal. Yeah, so just to be clear, that's what it should look like, and this is what it does. And so what this tells us is a couple of things. By the way, are we in Bartow?
No.
Oh, I know. You guys used to meet in the Bartow side, right? Okay, because this is Bartow. Bartow was the only one of 159 counties that did not have anomalous drop-off in the lieutenant governor's race.
Well, they just made it.
Said differently, 158 of 159 counties suffered from this.
What is the R-squared value?
Here it's 0.117. And on the other one, 0.04. So it's literally triple. So here's, and you notice how the curve too, instead of being horizontal, is pretty steep. That's important. Let me explain why. This is Clayton, Fulton, DeKalb, Gwinnett, Cobb. What this graph tells us is that the votes that are missing come virtually exclusively from Democratic counties.
Amazing.
Yeah, it is, isn't it? And so I called the professor back and I said, well, it's funny that you asked that question. It turns out they come from mostly Democratic counties. Now, there are some really high rates of anomalies in small rural red counties, but the aggregate number of votes they represent is very small. So the reality is, of the 100 to 140,000 worth of votes that are missing, the top 5 to 10 Democratic counties would account for virtually all of it. Yeah, it's kind of hard for something to be totally accidental and only affect Democrats. And then even weirder, it only affects the Democratic candidate. So we go back and she says, you really need to look at this. That's bad. Do you have a question?
Yeah, and if you don't know, don't worry about it. But how did we drop off?
I don't have that right now,
Okay,
but
that's fine.
he would. And we can look it up, but my guess would be you were probably in the middle of the range.
Okay.
Because there were some small, tiny, deep red counties where the number was very high. But the bulk of it came from the heavy Democratic, so Clayton, Fulton,
I
DeKalb,
just wondered.
Gwinnett, and then a lot of the Republican-leaning, sort of not quite the smallest, but on the left-hand side, half of the scale would be normal-ish. Yeah, go ahead.
Is there anecdotal evidence also from those counties?
And funny enough, it is. Fulton County, from my perspective, is grab zero for this. Clayton is a close second. But yes, a lot of the anecdotes are from there. Yeah.
Do you have a plan to make this a historical event that never happens again?
I do. And that is why I'm still traveling and talking. And so, this is exactly the point. So when I called this, she goes, you really need to get a data scientist to look at this. So I called the Leadership Now project, which is nonpartisan, nonprofit, pro-democracy. In full disclosure, I am a founding member of the organization. So occasionally you will hear people grumble about me having written small donation checks to Republicans. That is partly why, because we meet with the bipartisan working group, we meet with the Problem Solvers Caucus, and our commitment as members is to support anybody who can actually be a functioning, governing representative at this point in the country, if they're not horribly offensive. And so that is why. Leadership Now project, you laugh because it's like a dinosaur these days, right? And so we go and we look at the Leadership Now project's data scientists. We send what we found to him, and within 40 minutes, he had called us back. He said, you're right. It's a very large anomaly. I actually haven't seen one this big, and it's worse than you think. This will be good. Missing 138,000 votes, that's already pretty bad. But it turns out, he says, your votes are only missing on electronic voting machines. Yeah, see the Floridian in the room is like, yeah, we know. She's like, yeah, we got it.
So
So,
the absentee ballots are all.
yes, and in fact, I'm going to show you, because I don't want you to take my word for it. The thing about math is it does not care what you believe or what your party is. There's a right answer. So I'm going to show you with math. And by the way, we've done this for Republicans too. It doesn't work, but we're getting there. So this is, again, 2014. It would be the same if you went to 2010. It would be the same in virtually any election anywhere in the country. This is drop-off. It happens to be from governor to lieutenant governor in the 2014 midterm. The red is absentee paper ballots. The blue is election day machine voting, and the gray is advanced in-person machine voting. Do you notice how all the curves are the same shape? Yeah, because does anybody in here actually vote differently or skip more races when you vote on a machine versus paper? Just checking. I've been asking for like 2 months at all these meetings, and nobody yet has told me yes, just anecdotally. So this is 2014, and this is my race. So the red is the paper ballots, absentee, hand-marked paper ballots, the only version of that. Incidentally, if we didn't include provisionals because the sample size is relatively small, if you did provisionals, it would be even more normal than this one. So paper ballots, no drop-off, no anomalous drop-off in the race. But both on election day and in early voting on the touchscreen DRE voting machines, there's anomalous drop-off. And what's interesting about this is I've heard some Republicans say, well, what if there was like a bad news story? Because I think one of these Republican bloggers wrote like a pretty nasty piece about me. P.S. The press overall was very good. In fact, on election day, the Washington Post ran a story that was the other woman who could make history in Georgia today. So apart from their one little right-wing blogger, who, by the way, only used his first name on his byline. That's how courageous he felt about what he wrote. The press was actually really good. But even if you believe their theory, this proves it's not true. Because the thing is that these absentee ballots are being cast at the same time those gray machine votes are being cast. So it's not about a point in time, it's about where you cast your ballot. Yes?
I think it's very important to remember that Brian Kemp was the Secretary of State overseeing.
I know, the umpire calls us on strikes, right? So back,
You can't have drop off from the top of the ticket in the governor's race. I think he wanted to ensure that if he lost, we wouldn't have two Democrats.
yeah, and Jeff Duncan this week has shown us a little bit of why, right? I don't know if you guys followed the story this week where he's trying to undo the last batch of Nathan Gill appointments. That's in his own party, Casey, to your point. Yes, I do think this is suspicious, and I'm personally, I've got some spare time, and I'm not going to let this go till we figure out what happened. So what's interesting is if you look at absentee ballots for all the statewide candidates in my race, those are all of their drop-offs. Look at this. Every one of them is exactly what it should be. So when we talk about hand-marked paper ballots, I just want you to understand, this is normal, this is not. And this is why. Because this is a touchscreen voting machine that is hackable, unsecured, and has no paper trail for an audit. And when people tell you, yes, we're going to do ballot marking devices that print out a receipt, you can tell them that's very nice. It is still not a paper ballot, right? And here's the thing. Do any of you read barcode? Humans in here who read barcode? Yeah, I know. I didn't think so. So what a ballot marking device does is it prints out a list of all your votes. So first of all, that means it's incumbent upon you to make sure there's nothing missing, number one. Number two, remember all those amendments? And you're trying to remember, was I supposed to vote yes or no? You have to remember that because it doesn't print out what the question was, just your answer. And then on top of that, at the top, to verify, the part that actually gets counted in the machine is the barcode, which you cannot read because you're a human. And so that is not the same as hand-marked paper ballots. And then we hear, but hand-marked paper ballots, there's so many problems. This is coming from state representatives whose kids all take the SAT, which are effectively hand-marked paper ballots. That's right. Read by an optical scanner. And for those of you who like math, like me, hand-marked paper ballots with an optical scanner cost about $30 million. Not cheap. This incorrectly tabulating machine costs $150 million, and that's just the initial payment. It's another $300 million worth of contracts over the next several years. So almost $500 million with a B, $500 million for machines that nobody can explain why this happened.
And aren't they doing that right now? Aren't there meetings right now?
Yes, this is in our state legislature right now. And it's amazing because the party of fiscal conservatism wants you to get the $500 million machines that they can't explain why it lost 130 to 8,000 votes in my race. And on top of that,
Of course they want those because
They can win.
Manipulate it.
well, I did not say that, but it's interesting that you did. And so again, this is all the statewide races only on absentee ballots. If you looked at provisionals, my guess is it would be the same. I don't think we ran this for all the races and provisionals. But what's interesting is this is the lieutenant governor's race. That light blue line, that's actually running ahead of the state ticket. Yeah. So, so I'll give you this one last peek, and then we'll talk a little bit about why I think this matters. So this is drop off. So 0 to 110, if you have 110%, that means negative drop-off or crossover voters is what we would call it. And this is the percentage of the vote that Stacey got. Each dot is a county. The blue dots, not surprisingly, are mine. And the red dots are my former opponents. Here's what's interesting. This little oval, these are red counties where I have a negative drop-off rate, meaning there were either Kemp Amico or Metz Amico voters. Now, thanks to secret ballots, we have no idea which is which. But we know there were crossovers. And actually, it's not a small number of them, right? So what this should look like is these should kind of gently, sort of snow globe down to about that 98% mark, right? Running just behind Stacey as the counties get more Democratic. But instead, there's this very strange thing that happens, which is as soon as Leader Abrams picked up approximately 25% of the vote in a given county, my residual vote, or what we're calling drop-off here, increases by 10% virtually instantaneously. Yeah, almost like a triggering event, which we don't know what causes that. It could be a programming glitch, tabulation error, but it's also what malware would look like, just if you're wondering. I'm not saying that's what this is, but I'm saying it would look very similar. where you hit a certain threshold and then boom, you can see the drop off here. And then as the counties get more Democratic, interestingly enough, my numbers actually get worse. Now see, my opponent's numbers were kind of normal. They hung around the middle here. And then a funny thing happens. On the other end of the spectrum, the last 25% of the Democratic, most Democratic counties, all of a sudden in places like Clayton, Fulton, DeKalb, Abrams, Duncan voters start materializing out of nowhere.
Because I did that, I'm just kidding. I'm kidding.
I mean, the guy, there's nothing wrong with anybody who puts their hat in the ring for office, but this is a person who doesn't support civil unions, let alone gay marriage, with the first gubernatorial candidate to march in the Pride Parade. I mean, just to put in perspective how different their politics are. So I think this is something that needs to be explained. So why am I talking about this, right? I'm not asking for a change in outcome, to be very clear. I'm not bitter about this. I love my day job. My kids are happy to have mommy back home for bedtime again. My spouse is grateful I don't drag him all over the state on the weekends. This is really much, much, much bigger than a race. My concern is twofold. Number one, these voting machines that they want to buy in this session, this year, for our next elections, are an updated version of this. They're no more secure. And until you can explain this, I'd like to know how anybody justifies that vote. And so when you talk to your representatives, when you engage in citizen advocacy, you need to be telling people hand-marked paper ballots. Ballot marking devices, voting machines, with a receipt and a bunch of barcodes you can't read is not good enough. And if anybody tells you it's too much hassle or it's problematic, ask them if their kids plan to take the SET or the ACT or whatever it is people take these days. Ask them if any of their kids take standardized testing. My kids are in 2nd grade and kindergarten. They've already taken like 3 rounds of it. And it's always bubbles that you fill in. We rely on that for many, many things. Yes, sir.
Are any of the lawsuits by the organizations that started working on this during the primaries going anywhere? I was looking at the Georgia Votes paper site.
Yeah.
And doing some research for our website. And
so there is a formal election contest in my race. I am not a plaintiff, and I will explain myself because I'm sure you would like to know why the heck I did not challenge the outcome. Number one is this took a month and a lot of money to get this understanding of what happened, and we still don't know what caused it, right? And the thing about our system is it's set up that you cannot have an effective election challenge without knowing what went wrong. You cannot know what went wrong if you don't have an effective election challenge that grants discovery on the machines. Can we go? Yeah, it's a bit of a racket, actually. And it's a chicken and egg problem is the way to think about it. But it's also a system that is designed to keep people like me from finding out whether or not there's a problem in the programming. Because you have to go back into the programming and potentially even source code, which is considered proprietary trade secrets, IP for the voting machine companies. So if we're going to move forward with some other form of voting machine, I would contend we need at least an independent, and I mean independent, not like independent people that the governor who's politically elected appoints, but independent functional experts who know what the hell they're talking about need to sit on a commission and audit these machines. Just like in a company, you have internal financial reporting and controls where you have to test a certain set of samples to make sure your receivables and your revenue recognition is correct. Then you go through an audit process, right? We do that for businesses all the time. I do that for a trucking company, right? We don't do that for our election system in an appropriate way. We don't have a paper trail. We don't have anyone who's neutral looking at these election systems. So number one, I want you to know hand-marked paper ballots. It is not the same as a hybrid. It is not the same as a ballot marking device. Until somebody can show you their magic trick and read a barcode in front of you, that's not good enough. Number two, we need to understand what this means. You've got to ask yourself, the Secretary of State, we've corresponded with her office. I've met with Robin Crittenden when she was in office. She was very gracious. Now, she didn't share any information because she brought legal counsel with her and told me that there was pending litigation. That litigation process is the only recourse people have. There's only one reason I wasn't a plaintiff. I thought if I took the question of outcome out of this discussion and said, I'm not asking for a change in outcome. I just want a conversation about democracy, that we could have that as grown-ups. And it turns out that's not how it works, and I was a little naive. So the lawsuits now, They were thrown out in the challenge to my election. They've appealed to the Supreme Court. I believe they're going to go back, and I think they're going to be way stronger as a case. And I believe they will get discovery on these machines. And if they do, I think it's better than an 80 or 90% chance we'll actually know what happened. And the reason that's important is not because of the lieutenant governor's race, guys. We have elections for this every 4 years. The reason it's important is because if we can't figure out what happened, it will happen again. It's not a question of if, it's when. And it doesn't necessarily have to happen to a Democrat. I mean, this could easily happen to a Libertarian or an Independent or a Republican. So we've got to be able to prevent it. But they've got to survive their appeal to the Supreme Court is the next step in litigation. Yes, in the back.
Have you looked at other states?
Yeah, in fact, it's funny, in the middle of all of this happening, Broward County was missing, remember, 24,000 votes between the governor and the Senate. And I'm sitting there thinking, it's like 140,000 and nobody's talking about this. It was actually quite frustrating, but the narrative in Georgia was so much about the civil rights piece of it and the ballot box access issues, which are huge and important and need to be litigated the way that Fair Fight is going to do. But at the same time, once we get people to the ballot box, they need to have confidence that their vote's going to be accurately counted. And I don't want you to feel depressed about this. This is really important. The third time I gave this was in Gilmer County or something. And one lady came out and said, I'm so depressed. And I thought, well, I just drove like 3 hours round trip here to like give you hope for democracy. So clearly I screwed up, right? And what I told her is, no. You got to adjust your thinking. This has probably been happening in one fashion or another since we've had these machines. Maybe on smaller scales, maybe in different ways. The fact that we're now talking about it and that for whatever reason it was this extreme in my race, that's a great thing. Because now that we know there's a problem, we can fix it. Before, we were completely blind, right? And so I want you to feel empowered that this is the beginning of a conversation that can actually fix the problem. Yeah.
I also think it's interesting that 3 days after the election, there were voting machines in a very democratic part of Cobb County, was laying in middle school for 3 days
Yeah.
after the Republican primary.
Which makes an audit of those machines, by the way, virtually useless.
Yeah.
Right? It's not secure. Can you imagine if, imagine we were not counting votes but dollars here, and your accountant calls you up and says, no big deal, but we're missing $100,000, not votes, right? And then, oh, by the way, because it was like a losing quarter for you, we're not really going to investigate. Because that's effectively what the Secretary of State told me. I said, look, I don't know that it'll change the outcome. I just think we need to look. And she said, well, if you admit it doesn't change the outcome, then we don't need to look. And I thought, I feel like Alice in Wonderland. I'm sitting at the Mad Hatter's Tea Party hearing double talk. And I think, the idea that justice and accurate elections are only for the winners is insane. It's literally the antithesis of what it means to be a democratic republic. Yes.
I hope that the candidates across the United States and our current elected representatives grab hold of this words you use, hand-marked paper ballots with scanners. And we start hearing that repetition that she was talking about in the conversations of every election and on CNN and anywhere else that they can. If you're running for an office or you're in office, and us as candidate citizens working for you and whatever, we all need to jump on that phrase and start getting it out there and repeat, and get attention to it by the national press as well. Because that's the only way this is going to change. Once you get the national press start digging into stuff, because they keep hearing it over and over, no collusion.
Yeah. No, but I do think it's important. And I think the other thing is it's very easy for people. In fact, I heard a Democratic representative on a local news program in Atlanta, I will not say who, the other day say that, oh, I think a hybrid system sounds really good. And I was like, clearly, and it was somebody who had seen this. And I thought, well, I clearly need to restate, hybrid is not okay.
Nope.
If you mean hybrid, hand-marked paper ballots and optical scanners, okay, but I don't think that's what it's usually meant. Usually it's meant a ballot marking device that prints a paper receipt. That is not good enough for our voters. And we have all those people, hundreds of thousands, who cast their ballot for the first time. I want them to come back. And I want them to like walk out feeling like they're on top of the world because they just participated in the greatest democracy on the history of the planet Earth. And they cannot do that if they're wondering whether or not their vote got counted, right? Yeah, go ahead.
Quick question. I mean, I'm being careful how I phrase this.
Yeah,
So-
I'm trying, but
Yeah,
I'm
yeah, no.
sarcastic by nature, so it's
Yeah,
hard.
and there's something seriously wrong here. We're
Yeah.
being careful where we're putting accusations and things, but there's something wrong.
Mm.
But I guess what I wanted to throw out there, maybe if you want to comment on, is that I don't mean this in any ways it's like Stacey Abrams. We love Stacey Abrams to death. We were an incredible candidate. We're going to see many great things from her coming up. But if you were to ask most Georgia politicos
Mhm.
what races they think that the Democrats would clinch, probably first and second would be yours, and then John Barrow for Secretary of State. That would have enough crossover appeal, or a little bit more, that maybe there are some people who just, they were going to vote for Republican governor no matter what.
Mhm.
But you with your strong business background, John Barrow with his name recognition and representing some leading red areas
Yeah.
for such a long time. So doesn't it seem just especially odd there would be this drop off in yours? 'Cause if
Yeah.
anything, they were scared of having a Kemp and Sarah Amico thing going on.
They should have been. That
Yeah.
would have been a lot of fun. Not nearly as much fun as having a Governor Abrams and
Yeah,
Lieutenant
yes.
Governor Amico, but yeah, I would have made his life pretty miserable.
Yeah.
So, and it turns out, for those of you who don't know the role of Lieutenant Governor, they control what gets a vote on the state Senate floor. So literally, you can block anything. And so it's interesting. One of the things, for example, you could deny a vote on the floor is, say, spending $500 million on voting machines that don't count correctly. And the other thing you should know about those voting machines is apparently Georgia is one of, if not the largest voting machine vendor contract in the nation. So most of these are localized decisions around the country. Georgia has a uniform standard, which has a lot of advantages. I'm going to be very honest about that. One of the disadvantages is this is the white whale for every voting machine vendor in the country, is the state of Georgia. Yeah.
Is your data being used for this lawsuit?
I've shared it, so let me tell you a little secret. Yes, we've shared data with the plaintiffs, but it's all data we've shared publicly too. So we don't make a big fuss about it, but all of this is on our website, and including our letters back and forth with the Secretary of State. Yeah.
So Michelle was talking about amplifying your message, and unfortunately I did not get to sit through the DPG meeting for 7.5 hours, so bless you for doing that.
Bless you.
But have you, is there a video of your presentation that is able to be amplified that we can help project and get this message out more widely?
Yeah, let me think about that. The DPG would be a good one to do because I've done, I think it was like 10 minutes for the presentation. It was super quick because we were very time constrained, so it was like 10 minutes. And I can find it and I can get it to Casey and we can post it here, and I would love that. There are other discussions where we've had, an hour or more of just Q&A. And so the reason, and I literally haven't stopped traveling. Like this is, I think, the 10th or 12th time, maybe 15th that I've done this now. And I'm going to keep going because I want people to understand the stakes. For me, it was never about a race or an outcome. I love my day job. I love spending time with my kids. I got into running for office because I really feel our democracy is under threat. When you have a president who calls the free press the enemy of the people, when you have a Republican Party that doesn't understand what co-equal branches of government means, when you have a party, in this case the Republicans, that are actively working to make access to the ballot box harder, making Election Day a holiday. Andrea's Election Day on Sunday in Italy. My husband's from Italy originally. Yeah, so a lot of the Western democracies around the world, guys, Election Day is either on a weekend or it's a national holiday. But to listen to, the majority leader in the Senate, you would think it's like we all show up at the ballot box with our box of ballots, right? To stuff it right in. And it's crazy. We do not have a dance partner on the other side right now who is advocating for basic democratic institutions. And so my answer to that is rather than stay tucked away in my nice corner office in Kennesaw with my nice, very organized life, to come out here and get my butt kicked repeatedly by Republicans who aren't truthful, who don't advocate for the democracy that I love, and try to change it. And win, lose, or draw in this particular race, because there will be another, and I won't lose next time. Win, lose, or draw, this is a conversation worth having. And we need to have it with like everyone in every corner of the state, and not just Democrats, because I think that there are a lot of Republicans who may not like what's going on in their party right now. And I think a lot of them would hate this. And I think the Super Bowl commercial Stacey's gonna have tomorrow shows that. Yeah.
My name is Justin Messer. I grew up a Republican, former conservative, turned never Trumper.
Hey, there's a lot of us around.
Turned progressive. Stacey Abrams, and I've said this to many people, and I guess I had the first time really thinking of it now. Stacey Abrams was the first Democrat I've ever voted for in my entire life. If I recall, I guess you were the second.
Hey, are you sure?
This, you are correct, that this information disgusts most people who grew up Republican.
Yeah, I did.
Disgusts most people who grew up anything.
Yeah.
And this is the information that needs to be shared. So bless you for coming and sharing it with us.
Thank you so much.
Please continue to do so.
Thank you. That means the world. So a lot of you know this, but I was a Republican probably for a decade, honestly. And then I was an independent for a while. And then a few years ago, maybe like 2012, my dad took me to lunch and he was like, you do understand you don't actually agree with anything the Republicans say, right? And I was like, what do you mean? And he was like, hey, you've been a Democrat for a long time, but nobody has the heart to tell you. And I think it turns out I'm not only a Democrat, but pretty progressive, actually. I mean, which is funny, right? You don't meet a lot of CEO trucking company owners who are evangelicals who like are pro-equality, pro-choice, and like real loud and proud about it. But it turns out, I always tell people there's nothing in the Bible about firearms, but there's a whole lot in there about how we care for poor folks and refugees and love our neighbors, like without condition. There's no love your neighbors, but only if they love, pray, live, think like you do. And so for me, I actually appreciate you sharing it because it's similar to my own story. And I feel like sometimes as progressives and sometimes as Democrats, we're so caught up in like understanding the justice we're fighting for, we forget that there are other people that if we'll stop and just have a human conversation instead of a partisan with them, they share our values too. Because the funny thing is, you know, I've been super political my whole life. I mean, literally, I've studied American government for more than 25 years. I can't think of a single policy position I've changed. Isn't that interesting? Like, there's actually video of me from high school talking about being pro-choice. It's like a 16-year-old. And talking about how women should have equal pay. And you know, I grew up as a theater kid, so like I didn't have a lot of straight guy friends growing up. Like, you know, I was always into equality. You know, so it's interesting. My views haven't changed. And I don't know if I thought I had to be a Republican because I wanted to go into business or because of my faith or because it was just what everybody was where I grew up. But I think our values in this party, in the Democratic Party, in the progressive movement, I want you guys to have the confidence. These are the values that have always made the world better. This is about how we care for one another. This is about how we create justice that touches everybody, not just the people who are like us. This is about making people feel like they belong here to profit and enjoy from the same justice and values that we all have, from the same democracy we all share, from the same speck of dust we all fly through together in the universe. That's the thing that gets my heart excited about our democracy. And I love that you shared it, and it's perfect for this, because this is the reason, right? This should not be a partisan question. And the thing that's been most frustrating for me is the sheer lack of intellectual curiosity on the part of the Republicans as to what happened. And what I think will happen is eventually they'll get enough traction with this story that they'll have to come up with some alternative narrative. And I'm sure it won't be flattering for me. I'm sure they will try to explain it away. But the great thing about math is you can't explain this away. It just needs to be solved. It's a great mystery, and it should not be a partisan one. But when we solve it, we will make democracy better, not just for our party, but for everybody who lives in the state of Georgia. So let's do one more, and then I know you're probably freaking out because I've taken too long.
This presentation being put forward at the meetings where they're discussing the issue.
So I did testify in Roger Bruce's caucus committee hearing on voting rights this week. Actually, Jim Galloway in the HSC did another piece after that. Yeah, it is, but you know, I don't have the same megaphone, right, that the Stacey Abrams sort of organization does. What I do have is math that I think is really compelling, and an ability to explain it, I hope, in a way that's really accessible, even if you didn't major in statistics. And a husband who's like way better even than I am with analytics and data and statistics, who can kind of keep me on the path of what else can we learn, what else can we cut from this data that will teach us how to make the democracy we love and we live in, and that in his case, he crossed an ocean to be a part of and chose to become an American, that we can keep it vibrant and that we can keep it working for everyone, not just the people who think like we do. So I really appreciate the opportunity. I am still on Twitter, so if you if you want to follow this as things come up, that's a really good way to get real time. We also have a good bit of fun on Twitter. It's at Sarah Riggs Amico. Our website has all of this data. It's Sarah, S-A-R-H, 4-F-O-R, Georgia spelled out.com. We never shut it down, and now we're just throwing this stuff up there, so it'll probably be there forever until we run for something else. Facebook is probably not the most active, and I also am on Instagram, and we talk a little bit about some of our findings, and it's at Sarah Riggs Amico there. But Twitter is definitely the place that I am most likely to post updates as they get in, and would love for y'all to be a part of the conversation. I hope this was helpful. I hope it inspires you to like hand-marked paper ballots and making sure that we hold your leaders accountable if they decide to vote for unsecured, very, very expensive touchscreen voting machines. Thank you guys very much.
Well, that was kind of scary, but also very hopeful, good to know.
I'm still working on how to get that message across. But
No,
yeah.
it's terrifying, but obviously something's very, very wrong. So I want to reiterate, let's get this out there. Let's promote the fact that this happened, and we need to get to the bottom of this and find out what went on there. Because again, like I expected there to be more votes for you than for Stacey Abrams on the Democratic Party tickets. The fact that there's that drop off there is just it's insane.
We're not, we're still on.
Yeah.
I will tell you anyway. We have a joke that like if somebody were trying to impact the entire ticket through programming on the voting software, we have a joke